A few weeks ago, I invited the American Psychological Association to have a friendly debate with me about their new guidelines for working with boys and men. It was a sincere invitation. I wanted to give them a forum to defend their ideas and answer my questions and respond to the objections they've been receiving. And in the spirit of charity, I thought it might be an interesting cultural opportunity for someone at the APA to meet an actual full-blooded man. Give them a brush with adventure to tell the grandkids about. So far, they haven't even had the courtesy to respond, so I will continue the conversation without them. And in this video, I'm not going to discuss any of the 10 guidelines. Instead, I'm going to take a peek under the hood and examine the ideology and the sources behind the guidelines. You might expect, as I do, that clinical guidelines would be based on science and well-validated research, but these guidelines are ideological from the ground up. They make no pretense that the goal is anything other than to advance feminist ideas and policy. And that's not just my assertion. The mission statement of the APA Division 51, which is largely responsible for these guidelines, proudly acknowledges its historical debt to feminist-inspired scholarship. We're going to take a look at the most important pieces of that feminist-inspired scholarship, and sadly, it's not as scholarly as you might hope. Clearly, there are some good intentions in the guidelines, like when they mention that few clinicians know how to recognize depression in men, but that kind of clinically relevant observation is almost a minor theme. These guidelines seem preoccupied with a different idea, the idea that masculinity is a socially constructed disease and feminism is the cure. Whenever I read a paper closely, one of the first things I look at is the reference section. That's where you can get a sense of what went into the paper, and if there's any slant or bias, you can usually catch a whiff of it here. Sometimes what stands out most is what's conspicuously absent, and there's a lot missing in these guidelines. They blatantly omit findings from evolutionary psychology, neurology, biology, endocrinology, even the cognitive sciences. And what do all those disciplines have in common? Well, they all provide evidence of innate differences between male and female bodies and minds. So I wonder, why did the APA exclude them? Well, since they won't talk to me, I'll just have to speculate that acknowledging innate differences would undermine one of their primary contentions, which is that masculinity is a social construct and can be unlearned. I imagine that contention is easier to make if you omit every scrap of data that says otherwise. Whatever their rationale, they excluded a tremendous amount of information. As unbelievable as it is, the word testosterone doesn't appear a single time in these guidelines. And that's not just the boner hormone. It influences our mood, our sleep, how we handle stress and anxiety, our social status. It makes us competitive, but it also makes us cooperative, and that's just for starters. And I realize guidelines don't need to include that level of detail, but a nod in that direction would have been useful because these are important things for clinicians to understand. I would have liked to have seen that sort of scientific influence in the references, if not in the body of the guidelines. But the APA chose to go in a more political direction with references like these. Rethinking mental health and disorder, feminist perspectives, assessment and treatment of trauma with transgender and gender nonconforming clients, a feminist approach, debating trans inclusion in the feminist movement, gender trouble, feminism and the subversion of identity, racial and gender attitudes as predictors of feminist activism among self-identified African American feminists, and of course, feminism and psychology. Then we get into the racial stuff like white male power and privilege, the relationship between white supremacy and social class, white privilege and male privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. That last one's a mouthful. We'll come back to it in a minute because it's important. To be fair, there are roughly 425 references, and plenty of them are on topics like fatherhood, health behaviors, substance abuse, suicide, even retirement. I haven't looked into them all, but most of them on the surface seem to be even-handed and constructive. Nevertheless, there's a distinct bias in these references, and it shows up loud and clear in the guidelines. For example, when they state that male privilege often comes with a cost in the form of adherence to sexist ideologies designed to maintain male power that also restricts men's ability to function adaptively. That's a hell of an indictment and a lot of accusations packed into one sentence. That kind of social justice gobbledygook with all its emotionally charged language and vague terminology, it's straight out of gender studies, a field that is not known for its intellectual rigor. And by the way, you see that reference date 2005? That's one of the authors the APA cited repeatedly throughout the guidelines. To give you a sense of his mindset, here's a sample. This comes from the abstract of a paper called White Male Power and Privilege, the relationship between white supremacy and social class, and is pretty typical of his writing. Power governors were created to support an ideology of white supremacy and to organize actors within the system to perpetuate and legitimize the status quo. This is just unhinged political ranting. Frankly, it sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory, and it has no place in a set of treatment guidelines. But there it is. Again, in fairness, there are plenty of sections in the guidelines where racism and feminism are not the focus, but there's an undercurrent that surfaces throughout the guidelines. It's the idea that men are privileged oppressors, and the APA singles out white, heterosexual men in particular. Everyone else apparently is their victims. This is all in accordance with radical feminist ideology, which sees the world through a very simple lens. Men are the problem, men are the source of injustice, and the solution is to rewrite masculinity. The APA laid the groundwork for that idea right out of the gate with the glossary that precedes the guidelines. They devoted a page or so to defining terms, which is a nice practice in a document like this. Some of the definitions are just descriptive, but two of them are fundamental concepts. They're privilege and oppression. These are arguably the two most important terms in the entire set of guidelines. They frame the problem and build the solution from the ground up, and without these two terms, the guidelines would have an entirely different character. Because of their prominence, they deserve some scrutiny. So let's look at privilege first. The APA defines it as unearned sources of social status, power, and institutionalized advantages experienced by individuals by virtue of their culturally valued and dominant social identities, for example, white, Christian, male, and middle upper class. The idea that men operate from a position of privilege is so important that it shows up in the very first paragraph of these guidelines. Throughout the rest of the document, the APA lays out the case that male privilege is both an advantage and a disadvantage to men. They present it as a main contributor to both the plight of women and the mental health problems of men. And since these guidelines are clinical in nature and people's health and safety are at stake, I expect their definition of this fundamental concept to come from clinical inquiry. They're essentially treating privilege as a social pathogen, so I want to see tight definitions and empirical data. But the APA chose to go in a different direction. There's no data here. None. They base their definition of privilege on a single essay called White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. This is a famous essay in social justice circles. It was written back in 1988 by a feminist professor named Peggy McIntosh, and it was reprinted in a 2008 textbook called Revisioning Family Therapy. The essay begins like this. Through work to bring materials and perspectives from women's studies into the rest of the curriculum, I've often noticed men's unwillingness to grant that they are overprivileged in the curriculum, even though they may grant that women are disadvantaged. If the APA wants to solve a real problem, they should figure out why radical feminists are incapable of writing a coherent sentence. And I know that was a cheap shot. It's actually an interesting essay. I think it makes an important point about not taking your luck for granted. But this important point is completely irrelevant to the APA guidelines because this essay is completely unscientific. This essay is an editorial, and the author herself was perfectly forthright about that in the third paragraph where she wrote, "This paper is a partial record of my personal observations and not a scholarly analysis. It is based on my daily experiences within my particular circumstances." This single reference that is so fundamental to the APA guidelines is nothing more than an opinion piece, but the APA is treating it as if it's scholarship. And let's keep the issue straight. I'm not suggesting that privilege doesn't exist. That's a separate discussion. I'm saying that if the APA wants to build treatment guidelines around this alleged pathogen called privilege, they have the burden of properly quantifying it and measuring its effects and using proper methodology to come up with interventions. Then, after all that, they need to test those interventions before writing treatment guidelines. As far as I can see, they didn't do any of that. It looks to me like they just made an emotional assertion and backed it up with a 30-year-old editorial. Now, I have no problem with the existence of the editorial, even if it was written back when George Michael was topping the charts. But I have a major problem with the APA passing that editorial off as scholarship, treating it as a foundational resource, and building a set of clinical guidelines around it. That is absolutely unacceptable. APA, for this alone, your paper deserves an F. Let's see if we have better luck with the second fundamental concept, oppression. According to the APA, oppression includes discrimination and systemic denial of resources to members of groups who are identified as inferior or less deserving than others. The theme here throughout the guidelines is that men are either oppressors if they're part of a majority group or they're oppressed if they identify with any other demographic. The idea of oppression is central to these guidelines. It shows up repeatedly, such as this pop psychology assertion that men use domestic violence to keep women in their place. And if I sound sarcastic about that, it's because I think that's a dangerously facile explanation for a very serious and complex problem. Oppression also shows up in this inscrutable passage, probably written by a feminist, that culminates in a vague reference to some kind of oppression caused by mysterious unseen forces. And there are other more legitimate references to oppression, for example, when they describe the experiences of sexual minorities. I think oppression is an imprecise word for that, but that's getting into the weeds. The point is, the idea of oppression is a cornerstone in the guidelines. It deserves precision, so let's see what kind of source material they scrounged up. The APA included 2 references in this definition. The first is a textbook called The Convergence of Race, Ethnicity, and Gender, Multiple Identities in Counseling. And just look at all those diverse cooking ingredients on the cover. I can tell we're in for a treat. I don't know what counseling means here, but I glanced through this book and it looks like the sort of thing you'd find in a low-rent certificate program where students learn how to finger paint with their clients. Now, I'm aware of how arrogant that sounds, but I went through rigorous clinical training. I worked in hospitals, prisons, rehab facilities, and county jails. I even spent 10 weeks in Bosnia working with an NGO that exhumed mass graves so that the families could give their murdered relatives a proper burial. I went to these places because I wanted to work on the front lines. During my years of training, I encountered a few books like this, but they never had any real clinical utility because that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to encourage students to become political activists in the clinic. The publisher of this particular book is very open about that fact. They even boast about it in the Amazon description where they say readers will recognize their roles and responsibilities as social justice agents of change. Wrong. It is not the job of mental health workers to change society. You do that on your own time, not when you're on the clock being paid to work with individual clients. But it gets worse. Here's what the author wrote in the preface. As professionals, we accept our responsibility to be agents of transformation by creating a more just and equitable world that reflects humane distribution of resources and opportunities. Wrong. I don't care if this author grooves on socialism, that's her business, but her political beliefs have no place in the clinic. I tell you what, let's have a look at the APA's own ethics code, which, by the way, they reference in the guidelines. I like this code of ethics. It's clear and sensible. It's helped me simplify my decision-making over the years. And when I have had problems, it's usually been because I strayed from the code. It's a thoughtful and very useful set of guidelines. The first and arguably the most important ethical guideline is called Beneficence and Non-Maleficence. It says, because psychologists' scientific and professional judgments and actions may affect the lives of others, they are alert to and guard against personal, financial, social, organizational, or political factors that might lead to misuse of their influence. The meaning of this phrase is crystal clear. Psychologists have a duty to keep our personal agendas separate from our professional behavior. And for those of you at the APA who somehow don't see the problem with bringing ideology into the clinic, just change the variables. Rather than social justice feminism, pretend there are psychologists out there selling their patients on conservatism. You wouldn't stand for it, and you know it. If you truly believe that your feminist ideology is good enough to prevent something like male suicide, a problem that you mention repeatedly in the guidelines, then it ought to be good enough to treat anything. So next time you have a toothache, maybe your dentist can whip out her feminist dentistry textbook and give your tooth a stern lecture about the patriarchy. That, by the way, is a term that the APA uses in the guidelines, but never defines. I guess we just have to take that one on faith.
Patriarchy, fuckface!
It's unbelievable to me that this is the caliber of literature the APA used to establish the foundation for their guidelines. The author isn't even a psychologist, and that's not a mark against her, but she's not bound by the ethics and the research methods psychologists are supposed to follow, so she shouldn't be advising psychologists on treatment. And the cherry on top, I searched the entire book and couldn't find a clear definition of the word oppression. Let's look at the next reference they included in their definition of that word. This book is called Feminist Perspectives in Therapy, Empowering Diverse Women. This is clearly the ideal treatment guide for boys and men and the perfect stocking stuffer for that special man in your life. Unlike the previous textbook, this one at least provides a definition for oppression. Of course, it's completely untethered from any empirical data, which is about what I expected at this point, so I'll leave it at that. But there are a couple of things about this book that are worth discussing. The first is that these authors also urge therapists to become activists in the clinic. In a set of guidelines for supervising student therapists, they wrote, "Feminist supervisors advance and model the feminist principle of advocacy and activism." Wrong. You can do that on your own time, not when you're supervising. I feel like I'm repeating myself here. There's something more intriguing about this book, though. In the very first paragraph, we find this statement. Readers may wonder why we have limited our focus to counseling and therapy with women, since many of the techniques and strategies of feminist therapy are applicable to women and men. Well, that much is debatable, but they go on to say, recent theory and research, as well as the scope of our own expertise, led us to concentrate this book on issues that are relevant to the lives of girls and women. Personally, I couldn't care less that they wrote a girl power book. That's fine, but I'm intensely curious about why the APA gave this particular book such a place of prominence in a set of guidelines for boys and men when the book proudly excludes the interests of boys and men. I'd love to ask the APA directly, but since they won't talk to me, I'll just have to speculate again that it's because the patriarchy-blaming ideology in this book fits the agenda they want psychologists to push in the clinic. And by the way, if you think I'm exaggerating when I say the APA is encouraging activism in these guidelines, they spell it out on page 10. When working with boys and men, psychologists can address issues of privilege and power to help them obtain the knowledge, attitudes, and skills to be effective allies. In other words, to become political converts and foot soldiers. They even go on to boast that re-educating men in the clinic has been linked to participation in social justice activities. APA, I'm thinking about mailing you a copy of your own ethics code. When I made a previous video that was critical of these guidelines, one commenter asked me if these guidelines really matter. The answer is yes and no. They don't matter to my clients because I don't push any political agenda in the office, and the APA is not requiring me to do so. As they put it, guidelines differ from standards in that standards are mandatory and may be accompanied by an enforcement mechanism. Guidelines are aspirational in intent. I might be risking my license with videos like this one, but I'm not breaking any rules if I ignore these guidelines, and that's the extent of it for independent psychologists like me. Unfortunately, people like me don't matter in the grand scheme of things. In the big picture, these guidelines are extremely important and very troubling. That's because the APA is the largest accrediting body for psychology training programs, and their accreditation is taken very seriously by students and their future employers. That's a big deal because it gives the APA power to exert tremendous influence over training programs. They're in a position to compel programs to impose this radical feminist ideology on their students and to train those students to impose it on their patients. So even though these guidelines are merely aspirational, any program that aspires to stay in business better fall in line. And I find that to be a troubling thought. I want to close on a personal note. A couple of weeks ago, I contributed to a piece in Quillette about these guidelines. Unsurprisingly, I was very critical. Christina Haas-Summers also contributed that piece, but she was far more charitable to the APA than I was. She pointed out some of the positive aspects of the guidelines, like the call for male-specific treatment protocols and the fact that they acknowledge the educational struggles of boys and the career difficulties of young men. They even praised fatherhood. Dr. Summers concluded that there is much that is good and important in the APA guidelines. I also noticed those positive points in the guidelines, along with a few other things. But this handful of concessions from the APA means nothing to me. So they threw men a bone. I figure somewhere in 20 pages they were bound to stumble ass backwards into something useful, and I'm not going to throw them a parade for achieving the bare minimum. I don't give prizes for correct spelling either. Now, I've never met Dr. Summers, but I have tremendous respect for her both as a scholar and as a gutsy individual who's willing to defend sensible ideas in the face of insensible opposition. Her words slowed me down and made me check my attitude. I dropped out of the APA 10 years ago because I saw them drifting away from science, but I've always taken a live and let live approach with them, until now. Now suddenly I'm acting like I need to avenge a crime against psychology, and I had to ask myself, why suddenly am I so unforgiving? The answer has to do with unintended consequences. Back in January, when the APA announced these guidelines in their magazine, The Monitor, one of the main authors of the guidelines said, if we can change men, we can change the world. I think he summed up the APA's position quite nicely. Social justice and radical feminist ideology say men and masculinity need to be reshaped, reined in, and cut down to size. The APA's plan to reshape masculinity seems arrogant, to say the least, but arrogance is a fault that I share, so that's not the unforgivable part. It's the chain of events they've initiated. There's another line from that Monitor article that's become infamously connected with these guidelines. Most of you have probably heard it. They wrote, "Traditional masculinity, marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, is, on the whole, harmful." The APA is clearly unhappy with the way that line has come to symbolize these guidelines. They even wrote an official statement that simultaneously dug a deeper hole and whined about supposed media misrepresentation. But I've read the guidelines closely, and while that one line certainly doesn't capture all the nuance of 20 pages, it is a perfectly fair summation of a set of guidelines that treats masculinity as a collection of traits that amount to a mental disorder. That line may be oversimplified, but it's accurate. Maybe that's why the APA wrote that line in the APA Monitor, which is published by the APA. If young men and boys receive nothing else from these guidelines, it will be that simple message. You're damaged. You're a risk to yourself and others. Shame on you. There's a different message that would have been far more useful to young men, that they can cultivate their masculine traits rather than repress them under a layer of shame. Embrace them, refine them so you can use them for good purposes. That's the recipe of peaceful civilizations, and masculine men know how to help boys master their impulses. It's never been a perfect process, but it was certainly good enough to help create the safe and comfortable world the APA lives in. But the APA, driven by a radical ideology, is advocating a reversal of that recipe. Masculinity is no longer to be guided by men. Now that training is to be guided by women who resent men. Women who view masculinity as the problem, not the solution to problems. This is an untested idea, and it strikes me as exceptionally volatile and ill-advised. One of the worst things you can do to a man and the people around him is to teach him that his very nature is irredeemable, and he should be repulsed by himself. There's really no better way than that to create all the problems the APA is supposedly trying to solve with these guidelines. But that's a topic that deserves its own discussion, so I'll leave it at this. Most young men have natural inclinations toward traits like competitiveness, aggressiveness, the desire to project strength and confidence rather than weakness. These qualities are largely innate to most men. That's a fact the APA would have stumbled across repeatedly had their source material been more diverse and inclusive. As it is, these guidelines create more questions than answers. For example, does the APA know what effect this discouraging message of theirs will have on male depression, substance abuse, the ability to connect with women, even suicide? What about young women who possess an abundance of traits like stoicism and competitiveness? Are they broken too, or do they get a pass because it's called empowerment when women do it? And what about women who find themselves attracted to men with qualities like confidence, bravery, and the ability to contain their emotions? Heterosexual women generally prefer masculine men. If masculinity is harmful, what are these young women to make of their urges? And how will women respond to men who suppress their masculine tendencies, effectively feminizing themselves? What effect will that have on the sexual marketplace? And what effect will that in turn have on individual lives and families and society as a whole? Ideology has consequences. I don't know what the ultimate outcome of these guidelines will be, and neither do the psychologists at the APA. Apparently, they didn't even have the foresight to predict the immediate blowback they'd receive from this, so something tells me they haven't done the math on the delayed consequences of this ambitious ideological push. The long-term consequences might be negligible or they might be profound. Whatever the case, the outcomes probably won't be measured and the APA won't be held to account. They've cast a stone in the water and created some tremendous waves. And by the time those waves find their marks and do their damage, the stone will have long ago disappeared from view. That's the part I can't forgive. But hey, maybe I'm completely off base. If I'm wrong, I want to know about it so I can correct my heading. That's what men do. So if there's anyone at the APA who's willing to discuss all this, my invitation still stands. Give me a call. Send your finest champion. We'll light up a stogie, pour a shot, and have a civil exchange of ideas. You know where to find me.
Patriarchy, fuckface!